Chapter 2. Mayor Amschel Rothschild. The Frankfurt firm. It was in the Jewish quarter of Frankfurt that the founder of the great financial firm first saw the light. Goethe, who also owned Frankfurt as his birthplace, has left us a graphic description of the imperial city, which he states was composed of town within town, fortress within fortress. Not the least interesting portion of his description is that of the Jewish quarter, enclosed within the ramparts, but yet shut off from the rest of the city by heavy gates and high walls. It was a quarter frequented by few Christians. The houses, huddled close together, were packed from floor to roof with human beings living in a state of squalor and dirt baffling description, while the air was polluted with smells so vile and strong as to drive back all but those whose olfactory nerves had become deadened by long residence or familiarity with the noisome atmosphere. Goethe narrates how he would sometimes peep through the heavy gates and steal a glance at the strange scenes passing in that narrow lane, and goes on to describe what a shudder the sight caused him when he remembered the tales then current of the horrible cruelty and treachery of the Jews. At that time there was a general belief that human sacrifices were offered in the synagogues. Charges were often laid against the Jews of having kidnapped Christian children, who were never seen alive again. Through the midst of this home of the world's outcasts ran the Judengasse, a narrow, dirty lane lined with dilapidated houses, crowded with dusky, repulsive-looking Jews, who would wrangle, argue, and bargain with each other in tones so harsh and discordant that a stranger might well hesitate to venture among them. When, at last, Goethe did pass through the gates, and came into contact with them, their servile cunning, obsequious entreaties, and the filthy state of their persons, combined with the pestilential smells everywhere prevalent, so filled him with disgust that he determined never to visit them again. Years later he was led to considerably modify his opinion regarding these descendants of Israel, and he frankly acknowledged that on closer intimacy he found among them many men of quick intelligence and honorable principles, ready at all times to give him a hearty welcome. Everywhere I went I was well received, pleasantly entertained, and invited to come again. He witnessed many of their ceremonies, visited their schools, and confessed to having been very fond of walking with the dark-eyed, merry-tongued Jesus to the Fischerfelder on Sundays. A writer in a recent number of the journal Der Debatz gave the following interesting particulars respecting the Judengasse and its inmates. No trace, said he, will shortly be left of the houses in which born, the German writer, and Mayor Amschel Rothschild, the founder of his family's fortunes, first saw the height. Since 1872 only a single row of houses has been left, as one side of the street has been pulled down after the fall of two houses, when 31 persons were buried in the ruins. Looking at the Judengasse in its present aspect, one is struck by the narrowness of the houses. They have 3 stories facing the street, and the whole of the facade is studded with small windows. The gables are pointed, and access is gained to the houses by 3 or 4 steps. The doors open into a dark passage, at the other end of which is a worm-eaten wooden staircase, the boards of which bend as one puts one's foot upon them. The rooms are small and low-pitched. They are inhabited by a few of the poorest and most squalid families, Jew and Christian alike. The room upon the ground floor is used as a shop by dealers in old clothes, shoemakers and tinkers. Several of the wealthiest merchants in Germany at the present time may regard these hovels as the home of their ancestors, who are now replaced by the poor wretches just mentioned. There is little that is picturesque about the Judengasse, and those who have had their curiosity whetted by the descriptions in Baedeker will see nothing comparable to what one comes across in Italian ghettos. More curious than the Judengasse is a tavern hard by, where the Jewish beggars meet at nightfall. This tavern, kept by a man named Elvi, consists of one long room, the walls of which are painted yellow. Little drink is consumed in this room, but the customers take their meals there and play cards. Round a circular table a cosmopolitan company, consisting of Jews from Poland, where the kaftan and the long curls are still worn, as well as from Paris and Berlin, may be seen conversing in low tones, and, upon the evening when the writer paid a visit to the place in the company of a detective, several women were there knitting, one of them being one of the handsomest persons he had ever seen, with magnificent eyes, a white skin, and jet black hair encircled by a kerchief of red wool. But though the Judengasse is not picturesque, its disappearance removes a most interesting historical monument. These decrepit houses revive recollections of another age. The land on which they are built, with the exception of the site owned by the Rothschilds, and on which their house stands, belongs to the town of Frankfurt. The Jews confined within their ghetto were not the owners of the soil, being merely tenants at the goodwill of the Council of the Free City. The Judengasse does not indeed date from earlier than the middle of the 15th century, and the walls of the quarter were destroyed by Kleber's army in 1796. During the first part of the Middle Ages, the condition of the Jews was comparatively easy. They were the serfs of the imperial chamber, and the emperor, in return for a fixed tribute, accorded them his protection, and was all the more interested in guarding them from ill usage as he was anxious to preserve for himself the privilege of taxing them. There is no precise evidence as to when the Israelites came to settle in Frankfurt, their presence being officially referred to for the first time in 1240. The first massacre of the Jews took place in 1241, when 180 of them perished. 100 years of comparative peace ensued, though their relations with the Christians gradually became more strained, their wealth and their mode of life and religion inflaming the superstition, the fanaticism, and the cupidity of the lower orders. The worst phase of persecution commenced in 1349, the year of the Black Plague. The country round Frankfurt was scoured by bands of flagellants, who went about declaring that the Jews ought to be put to death for having poisoned the wells. When the inhabitants seemed deaf to their appeals, the flagellants set several houses on fire, and then spread through the streets exclaiming, "The Jews are burning your houses." The stratagem succeeded, and there was a general massacre. In the same year the Emperor, Charles V, had mortgaged his Jews to the town of Frankfurt for a sum of about 80,000. This sum was never repaid, and the Jews came under the immediate jurisdiction of the council. This rendered their position much worse, for the emperor had allowed them to manage affairs much in their own way, and to choose their own judges. They preserved, nevertheless, a certain degree of autonomy, and for some time the only thing which distinguished them from the ordinary citizen was that they had no political rights. Their existence was, however, precarious, and their fortunes often threatened. Thus in 1389 the Emperor Wenzel suppressed by one stroke of the pen the obligation to pay what was due to them, and now and again during a riot numbers of the account books in which they inscribed the sums owing to them were burnt. There was about this time a Jews' street at Frankfurt, but it was not inhabited exclusively by Jews, for many of the best Christian families lived in it. Thus the burgomaster resided there from 1364 to 1375. Still, as their synagogue, their baths, and their assembly room for dancing were in this street, most of the Jews lived near it. But, as it was close to the cathedral, their enemies declared that their cries and blasphemies disturbed the Catholic worshippers. Public feeling became more and more hostile to them, and in 1425 they were prohibited, under a heavy penalty, from taking the name of burgher. The most cruel blow, however, was yet to come. Frederick I, in compliance with the prayer of the clergy, ordered the Jews to remove from the neighborhood of the cathedral, and, though they offered to wall up the gate of the street leading to that edifice, their offer was refused. The council selected a site outside the ancient walls of the town, and had houses built at the expense of the Jews. It is thus that the council owns the ground on which the Judengasse stands. The gates of the ghetto, which were very strong and lined with iron, were kept closed every Sunday and Saint's Day, as also upon the days when the emperor entered the city. The Jews were enjoined not to show themselves in public, nor to pass by any church. If business brought them to the town hall, they were not allowed to enter by the main door but by a small door from behind. The men were compelled to wear a yellow patch about the size of a crown piece upon their garments, and the women blue stripes to their veils. They were also enjoined to make room for other citizens on the pavement, and not to touch any of the articles in the market. They were not allowed to buy fish before a certain hour of the day, nor to hire Christians as servants. The council consented to dispense with their wearing the distinguishing cap on payment of a fine of 250 florins, but they were compelled to have either a black or a grey hat. They were forbidden to lend money to minors or to women, to sell new clothes, or to lend upon clothes which were wet or stained with blood. These minute regulations, together with many more of a similar nature, were read out every year in the synagogue. The Jews, in short, must have paid very dearly for the privilege of living in Frankfurt. The number of marriages between them was even limited, for there could be only a fixed number of houses, the different couples having to wait their turn. Strange Jews were not allowed in Frankfurt, and yet that city must have offered them comparative security, for the Jewish community of Nuremberg sought refuge there in 1498. Protected by their walls, the Jews of Frankfurt escaped pillage during the revolt of 1525, but the democratic revolution of 1614 drove them out of the city, and they did not return for 2 years. When order, however, was restored, they came back, and, so as to make it quite clear that they were under the protection of the empire, the imperial coat of arms was displayed above the gate of their street. In 1711 the whole street was burnt down, but the Jews were so afraid of pillage that they would not open their doors, and many perished. The Judengasse was rebuilt in 1717 and made rather wider. While the work of reconstruction was progressing, the Jews were allowed to lodge in the town, the poorest being accommodated in an empty hospital. There were 2 other fires in the Judengasse during the 18th century, and the shells from Kleber's guns in 1796 set fire to 150 houses. The wealthiest of the Israelites availed themselves of this opportunity to settle in the town, and they were not again molested. The gates were demolished in 1808, and many restrictions were removed. The Prince Primate granted the Jews, in 1811, equal civil and political rights with those enjoyed by the other inhabitants, but they lost these again in 1815, and did not recover them until 1853 and 1864. In 1811 there were 159 houses inhabited by 2,214 persons in the Judengasse, while at the present time the Jews number 14,000, or 11% of the whole population. Here, then, in the Judengasse, in the house numbered 152, but better known as the House of the Red Shield, Rothschild afterwards adopted as a surname Live Damschel Moses Rothschild, earning a livelihood as a dealer in curiosities and old coins. In the course of his business he was in the habit of traveling about the country, hawking his wares and keeping his eyes open in search of curiosities, and an anecdote is related of him tending to show on what a thread the destiny of the family at one time hung. In reproducing this anecdote, we wish it to be understood that we do not attach any value to it ourselves, our object only being to make the narrative as complete as possible. Many of the stories related of the Rothschilds are pure myths, for lively imaginations have placed a halo of romance about their history, as about that of every other person of notoriety, so that implicit credit cannot always be attached to the anecdotes told of the different members of the firm. The story in question is to the effect that Rothschild was one day walking along a country road, when he was overtaken by a brother peddler in more flourishing circumstances than he himself, seeing that he had an ass to carry his wares. In the course of conversation, Rothschild was invited to relieve himself of his load by placing it on the ass's back, an offer he was glad to accept. On coming to a narrow ravine where the bridge across was formed by a single plank, Rothschild prudently removed his sack from the ass's back to his own shoulders, remarking as he did so, "Accidents sometimes happen at places like this, and, as this sack contains all my fortune, it is well to be on the safe side." His comrade laughed at his fears, but Rothschild's prudence was fully justified by events, for no sooner had the ass, followed by his master, reached the middle of the bridge than the plank gave way, and both were precipitated down the chasm. Thus by a miracle Rothschild saved both his life and his money. We have already mentioned that the number of Jews allowed to marry was limited, but Rothschild, having gained permission, availed himself of his privilege and took unto himself a wife, who, in 1748, gave birth to a son whom they named Meir Amschel. When the boy grew up and his parents had to decide as to his future in they resolved to have him educated with a view to his becoming a rabbi, or teacher in the synagogue. This resolution was not unnatural, seeing that several of the family had been or were then celebrated for their knowledge of the Talmud and the doctrines of the Jewish faith. Dr. Lewison states that in the Jewish cemetery at Worms is buried Rabbi Menahem Mendel Rothschild, who had been the chief rabbi to the congregation there. Isaac Rothschild was warden of the Frankfurt synagogue, Solomon Rothschild was chief rabbi of Wurzburg and Friedberg, and Boaz Rothschild was the author of a Hebrew work published at FRTH in 1766. Meir Amschel, in 1755, lost his parents and was sent by his relatives to Fürth to complete his studies. Theology was, however, not to his taste. He had been born and bred in the midst of a community whose whole thought centered upon getting and accumulating money. He had early learned to see in wealth the only true standard by which one could judge his fellow, and he not unnaturally shared the ambition that fired his comrades to acquire riches and a consequent name among his co-religionists. His instinct for business was too powerful to resist. Even while at college he had become well known as a collector and dealer in old coins on a small scale, and in this way had made the acquaintance of several numismatists in the neighborhood. This is surprising when we remember that he could not have been much more than 12 years old at the time, but with Jews the talent for business is innate, and their natural shrewdness and skill in making bargains more than compensate them for their youth and inexperience. Notwithstanding the limited resources at his disposal, Mayer Amschel seems to have pursued his youthful speculations with considerable energy and profit. At length, rightly judging that he was better fitted for commercial than theological pursuits, he abandoned his studies altogether and returned to the Judengasse, where his abilities and shrewdness soon became known among his co-religionists. His reputation reaching the ears of some of the large firms, several offers of employment were made him, and not being one of those who are content to spend their lives trotting on a cabbage leaf as the proverb says, when a wider field of enterprise was thrown open to him, he accepted the offer of a banking firm named Oppenheim in Hanover. In their service he remained several years, gaining and maintaining a high character for steadiness and reliability, while his energy and abilities were recognized by his gradual promotion to the responsible post of co-manager. Frugal and economical in his habits, he was able to save a considerable portion of his salary until he thought he possessed sufficient capital to make a start on his own account. He therefore left Oppenheim's service and set up in business for himself, dealing in old coins, bullion, and anything by which he thought he could make a profit. For some time it was a hard, uphill fight, and more than once the budding firm was in danger of collapse, but the untiring energy and honesty of its founder, triumphing over all difficulties, placed it on a sound basis and secured its future safety. Some years later he determined to transfer his business to his birthplace, where he settled for good, as in 1770 he married Gudula Schnapp, and lived in his father's house in the Judengasse. His business was at the outset of a very mixed description, ranging from coins and curiosities, to bullion, bills of exchange, c. But as his speculations, distinguished by cautious boldness, were almost invariably successful, he was soon in a position to abandon the business of a dealer in works of art for that of a banker and financier. One of his earliest investments was to purchase the freehold of the house in the Judengasse, which has given birth to one of the greatest financial houses in the world. In all his business transactions he displayed remarkable honesty and integrity. So widely did he become known as the honest Jew that his reputation spread through the surrounding provinces, and was largely the means of securing him fresh business. A man of his character has never lacked friends, and Mayer Amschel found many persons ready and anxious to recommend him and gain him new clients. Oppenheim, his old employer, was especially zealous in promoting the success of his former employ, and never allowed an opportunity to slip of saying a word in his favor. During his apprenticeship at Oppenheim's, Mayer Amschel had more than once come into contact with Lieutenant General Baron von H. Estorff, an intimate friend of William X., Landgrave of Hesse, and had won his good opinion and esteem. When years later Baron Estorff, who, from his own knowledge and Oppenheim's accounts, was able to form an estimate of Rothschilds' worth, had an opportunity of advancing his fortunes, he did not hesitate to recommend him to the Landgrave as a person well qualified to act as his financial agent. Seeing that the Landgrave had a private fortune of 36 million thalers, it was indeed a most lucrative post to obtain. Rothschild received a summons to wait upon the Landgrave. When he was ushered into the room, he discovered His Highness deep in a game of chess with Baron Estorff, who seemed to be getting the best of the struggle. Not caring to disturb the Landgrave's calculations, which absorbed his attention so entirely that he had not noticed his visitor's entrance, Rothschild stood by, a silent spectator of the game. At last the Landgrave, in his perplexity and despair, threw himself back in his chair, and in so doing caught sight of the banker. He at once inquired of his visitor, "Do you know anything of chess?" Rothschild's answer was to point to a particular piece, saying, "Would your highness move this piece to that square?" The move he suggested was adopted, and at once put a different complexion on matters. So far from the game being lost to the Landgrave, it slowly turned in his favor, and was eventually won by him. He then conversed with Rothschild on the subject of the latter's visit. He was so highly impressed by his visitor's intelligence and address that he told Baron Estorff, after the banker's departure, that he had certainly recommended him no fool. The result of the interview was that Mayer Amschel Rothschild was appointed court banker to the Landgrave of Hesse. In 1804, Rothschild contracted with the Danish government for the issue of a loan of 4 million thalers, a sign of his growing influence and prosperity. At that time all Europe was in arms against Napoleon, who defeated and overran kingdom after kingdom. In 1806, the emperor sent a portion of his army to chastise Frankfurt and Hesse-Kassel for the support they had given to the cause of the Allies. The truth was that the Landgrave, having a keen eye for business, had found he could largely augment his already handsome fortune by placing his troops at the disposal of the Prussian and English governments, receiving in return large subsidies. This conduct reached the ears of the child of fortune, who determined to administer a severe punishment to the Landgrave by plundering and sacking Hesse-Kassel. The approach of the French becoming known, the Landgrave concluded that under the circumstances discretion was the better part of valor. He therefore made hasty preparations for flight. But although he would by flight secure the safety of his person, he could not render his money safe, for that he was forced to leave behind. Consisting as it did largely of specie, its mere bulk was a hindrance to its removal, and yet to leave it where it was would be but making a present of it to the French. In his dilemma he recollected Rothschild, and, thinking the banker might be able to take charge of his money, he had it packed and sent to Frankfurt. "Mayor," said the Landgrave, "I have already had some experience of your honesty and integrity, and have now to put it to further proof. I wish to deposit with you my whole fortune. To your care I leave it, to be returned to me in more peaceful and happier times. Such a signal mark of your confidence and esteem flatters and honors me, your highness. But do you not forget that the French will be here in a few days? Do you think so? And that in their train there always follows a band of lawless ruffians, who will fall upon us and plunder us without mercy. It will be a time of unrestrained pillage, as your highness must know full well. Well, Mayor, I leave my fortune to your care, and you will act as you think best. I ask no receipt from you, knowing that in your hands the money will be safe, if you can but keep the French from handling it." With these words the Landgrave left, paying no heed to Rothschild's protestations, on finding himself thus suddenly and unexpectedly saddled with the responsibility and anxiety attaching to the custody of so large a sum. Before the week passed all his prophecies were fulfilled. Frankfurt was in the hands of the French, who gave themselves up to plunder and wanton destruction. Rothschild, being a man of well-known wealth, was one of the first visited, and had to endure calmly and unmoved the sight of his premises being sacked and stripped of everything of value. He had, however, good reason for his calmness. By thus quietly allowing the French to seize his own property of no small value, he prevented a more thorough search of his premises being made, and so secured the safety of the Landgrave's money, which he had artfully concealed in wine casks in his cellars, or had buried in his garden. This was the turning point in Rothschild's career. It was the tide in his affairs, taken at the flood, and leading on to his future prosperity and fortune. Had the founder of the Rothschild family refused to undertake the trust confided to him, the course of European history might have been altered, and some of the most remarkable characters of the 19th century have remained unknown to fame. The trust was, however, faithfully kept, and Rothschild, after the French had once more left the city, started business afresh, and made such good use of the Landgrave's thalers that in a few years he was reputed to be richer than ever. He seems to have transmitted the whole of the money to his son Nathan, who was established in business in London. This son was already a well-known man in the English capital, where the astounding skill and boldness of his speculations had taken the city by surprise. He thus referred to the fortune left in his father's hands. "The Prince of Hesse-Kassel gave my father his money. There was no time to lose, so he, my father, sent it me, and I put it to such good use that the prince made me a present of all his wine and linen." A period of respite followed, during which most of the German rulers gave in, either willingly or from necessity, their allegiance to Napoleon. Being raised by the emperor to the dignity of Elector of Hesse-Kassel, William IX was enabled to return from his exile. One of the first persons he visited was, not unnaturally, Rothschild. He was aware, from the papers and other sources, of the pillage of Frankfurt, and knew that the house of the Jew banker had not escaped a visit. It had been reported to him, with every show of truth, that Rothschild had been robbed of all he possessed, and was completely ruined. Not knowing anything of the stratagem by which his fortune had been saved, the elector concluded that his thalers had gone to fill the pockets of the French soldiery. But he still resolved to visit his old agent, if merely to show that his regard and esteem for the latter had suffered no change. "Good day, Mayor, good day," said he, extending his hand. "At last we have peace again, though rather dearly bought. You see before you a poor devil of a prince as badly off as Job was." "You poor, my lord?" "Yes, to be sure, since those cursed thieves have run off with my thalers as well as yours. If it is not inconvenient to you, I should be glad to get some small advance from you against the indemnity that is to be made me. But your highness has no need to borrow. The money your highness entrusted to my keeping is safe and untouched. Teufel! Cried the prince. Why, did not the French plunder your premises? Pardon me, and I will explain. The French stripped me of everything belonging to myself, but I was careful not to irritate them by any violent resistance, else they might have made a more careful search in my cellar, where your money was hidden. What can it be? Yes, my resignation was a ruse. They little dreamt how great a prize they missed. Is it possible? Exclaimed the prince, almost dumb with surprise. For the last 9 years, your highness, I have taken the liberty of making use of your thalers to compensate myself for the loss of mine. All my speculations have been successful, and I can at this moment, without inconvenience, restore the whole sum to you, with interest at 5%. The prince was deeply moved, and with difficulty could express his gratitude and his admiration of Rothschild's noble conduct. Friend Mayor, said he, you are the most honest Jew I know. Keep my money, and do what you think fit with it. I want no interest on it for the time it has been in your custody, and for the next 20 years I undertake to leave it with you, and to receive no interest on it above 2%. This is the account given by some writers who, dazzled by the immense riches and power of the Rothschilds, were enabled to ascribe those riches and that power to ordinary business transactions, and so have gone out of their way to invent a romance for which they have no better authority than their imaginations. This story is derived from the Sprichwörter der Deutschen, and to show how little dependence can be placed upon its truthfulness, we need only mention that it is related about a Moses Rothschild of Frankfurt, of whom no one has ever heard, as there was no Rothschild of that name living. Further, the Landgrave fled from Kassel at the first approach of the French, and could not have gone to Frankfurt, as that city was already in the possession of the enemy. Neither could the money have been buried in the garden, as no gardens existed in the Judengasse, and the Jews were forbidden by law from owning any freehold property in any other part of the city. The true and varnished story seems to have been the following. Some writers maintain that Rothschild's connection with the court of Hesse-Kassel commenced during the lifetime of the Landgrave Frederick I, who died in 1785, leaving an immense fortune of 56 million thalers. This he had acquired by means of his poor subjects, whom, for handsome subsidies, he had placed at the disposal of the English government. In 1775 he raised a levy of 12,800 Hessian troops, who were shipped off to quell the rising of the American colonists, and further detachments, amounting to about 4,000 more, were sent at intervals. For the services of these men he received from England 22 million thalers. On his death he was succeeded by his son, William X, a warlike prince, who had seen some service under Frederick the Great. He followed his father's plan, and increased, by large subsidies from the English government, the vast fortune left him. In 1787 he was paid 600,000 thalers for the services of 12,000 men, and in 1794 he furnished the English with 4,000 more, who were employed in Spain against France. When the French invaded Germany, the petty German princes were unable to offer any opposition to their advance. They all fled before the soldiers of the Republic. The Landgrave in the first place went to his brother in Schleswig, but afterwards, in 1808, proceeded to Prague, where he met with a somewhat unpleasant surprise in the shape of an imperial decree which stated that the House of Hesse-Kassel has for some years past sold its subjects to the English crown, and by that means has amassed a large fortune. This detestable avarice has brought about its own punishment, as the house has ceased to reign. When the Treaty of Tilsit was concluded, Hesse-Kassel was incorporated with the Kingdom of Westphalia. Whether M.A. Rothschild was appointed court Jew by Frederick I, as some assert, or first became connected with the court owing to some dealings he had with William X, an ardent lover of old and rare coins, and whether his honesty and integrity had won the Landgrave's favor, is shrouded in doubt. It is certain, however, that when William X became Landgrave, M.A. Rothschild was the court Jew and managed all the Landgrave's financial affairs. The bulk of the Landgrave's fortune, there one has every reason to suppose, was invested in the English funds, as being the only safe and reliable investment, and it was Rothschild's duty to collect the dividends as they became due by drawing upon the firm of Van Noten in London, in whose hands the stocks were deposited. The commission he charged for this business must of itself have amounted to a large sum. That the Landgrave was satisfied with the way in which Rothschild managed his affairs may be inferred from the fact that he gave Rothschild's third son, Nathan, when he established himself in London, full power to deal with his stocks as he deemed best, and transferred to him all the business which the Van Noten firm had formerly conducted. His confidence must have been great, as Nathan Rothschild was allowed perfect liberty of action, and could sell out and reinvest the stocks confided to him as he pleased. When William X fled from Castle, his first great care was to provide for the safe custody of his money, and this we know M.A. Rothschild undertook to do. What was the exact sum entrusted to him on this occasion we cannot say with any certainty, though it is stated by some writers to have amounted to 2 million thalers. Now, instead of hiding or burying the money, as some have asserted, it would surely be more characteristic of such a shrewd man of business as Rothschild to have transmitted this sum to London to be disposed of as Nathan Rothschild thought fit. To conceal so large an amount from the French would be next to impossible, and, besides, it would have been madness for M.A. Rothschild to have kept the money himself, when its safety could have been secured by sending it to London. And that he did send it we have his son's word. The romantic version, therefore, seems to have very little truth in it, with the exception of the main point that the fortune of the Landgrave was the original cause of the subsequent success of the Rothschilds. The commission gained by the London and Frankfurt houses every year for managing the Landgrave's affairs must have been considerable, and would of itself have formed a sufficiently strong base for the many successful speculations which the Rothschilds entered into in the money market. Under these circumstances, they may not have speculated for their own benefit with the Landgrave's money at all, and were therefore able to restore it to its owner whenever he thought fit to claim it back. During the war in Spain, the Duke of Wellington experienced great annoyance and embarrassment from the failure of the specie supplies, and the English government were unable to assist him in his difficulty, as they could induce no bankers to assume the responsibility of conveying the money to Spain. At this juncture M.A. Rothschild stepped forward and offered to undertake the task for a pretty heavy commission. His offer was accepted, fortune smiled on his enterprise, and the money reached the Duke safely. This was a most profitable piece of business, as Rothschild is said to have cleared annually for 8 years a sum of about 150,000. The success of this operation, and the punctuality which distinguished its execution, induced the government to entrust the Rothschilds with the payment of the enormous subsidies to the various continental princes, and this, again, still further increased the growing reputation and influence of the firm. Thus it was that the Rothschilds made their first millions, and few can say they have gained their fortunes in an equally honorable and praiseworthy manner. When once the first million had been made, it was a comparatively easy task to add others. Water always flows to the sea, or, in other words, money makes money. But streams in their progress to the ocean become discolored by the muddy waters of affluent streams, and so with the Rothschilds' millions. The first were gained by the fairest of means, but some of those that succeeded were undoubtedly won by recourse to those expedients and artifices, common on the stock exchange, which are open to serious moral objections. Mayor Amschel Rothschild died on the 13th September 1812 in his 67th year. Just before his decease he summoned his 5 sons to his bedside, and with his last breath, after giving them his blessing, enjoined them to remain faithful to the law of Moses, to remain united until the end, and to undertake nothing without having first consulted their mother. Observe these 3 points and you will soon be rich among the richest, and the world will belong to you, a prediction that has been fulfilled to the letter. He left 5 sons, Anselm Mayer, Salomon, Nathan, James, and Karl, who soon after his death established a pentarchy. Anselm retained command of the original house in Frankfurt, whilst the others founded new branches in Vienna, London, Paris, and Naples respectively. By so doing they wonderfully increased the reputation and influence of the firm, and gradually gained that control over the different money markets which enabled them to augment their fortunes with such astounding certainty and rapidity. Although Mayer Rothschild is known to history merely as an eminent financier, money-making did not monopolize his time or thoughts. With all his engagements, he still managed to find leisure and opportunities for administering relief from his well-lined purse to his suffering fellow mortals, and many tales are told of his benevolence and charity. He would often stop a poor, starving creature in the street, to place a coin in his hand and hurry away to prevent his face being recognized. He moreover exerted his influence to obtain an extension of the civil and political rights of the Jews, and the abolition of the tyrannical restrictions from which they suffered. His wife Gudula survived him many years, dying in 1849 at the ripe old age of 96. Notwithstanding its dismal and filthy surroundings, the old house in the Judengasse was her home to the last. No entreaty or attempt at persuasion could induce her to abandon the house so intimately associated with the growth and success of the great firm, whose very name was derived from the sign by which the house had been distinguished from its neighbors. Superstitious scruples and a love of the old place combined to prevent her forsaking it. In her eyes it had some mysterious connection with the prosperity and greatness of the family. Here then she lived on, distinguished by the simplicity of her habits, until the thread of life was snapped and her remains were carried to the grave. The mother of the Rothschilds, the Hecuba of the European Croesus family, wrote an eyewitness during her lifetime, must be almost a centenarian, but so vigorous and active is she still, that she manages to visit the theatre nearly every night. There she sits in her box, with a fan in her hand to shield her eyes from the dazzle of the HGHTS, with an old Jewish hood, adorned with flowers, upon her head, no hair visible, dressed in colored silks, with the most costly lace about her neck and breast. Of her sons, Anselm is most like her. She lives in the Judengasse still, in the same house as when she, at that time the wife of a needy shopkeeper, brought her children into the world. This old musty house, in the dampest and most unhealthy street in the city, she has never been willing to abandon. Here I have seen, said she, my sons grow rich and powerful, and, as I have not become conceited in my old age, I will leave them their good fortune, which would certainly forsake them, were I from pride to abandon my humble dwelling. Owing to the narrowness of the street, no vehicle could approach her house, and her son's carriage could come only as far as the entrance of the gas when she returned from the theatre, so that she was always carried home from the carriage. Heine, in his work Ueberborn, gives us a pleasant description of a walk he took through the Judengasse, together with an interesting reminiscence of the first Rothschild and his wife. In this small house lives the worthy dame, the Letizia, who has given birth to so many Napoleons of finance. The great parent of all loans, who in spite of the worldwide rule of her kingly sons, will never consent to leave her little, but fondly cherished palace in the Judengasse, and today, owing to the great festivities, her windows are adorned with white hangings. How pleasantly the lamps shine which she ate with her own hands on the 18th October of the Jews, which has been celebrated now for more than 2,000 years in remembrance of the day when Judas Maccabeus, with his equally brave and heroic brothers, set his country free, as did Frederick William in our day. The tears spring to her eyes as the good old dame looks at the lamps, for they bring back to her the memory of Mayor Amschel, her dearly loved husband, and of her children, then young children, who would plant the lamps in the ground, and with childish glee jump over and round them. Old Rothschild, the founder of the reigning dynasty, was a noble soul, goodness and kind-heartedness itself. A benevolent face with a pointed little beard. On his head a three-cornered hat, and his dress quiet and sober, if not poor. Thus would he go about in Frankfurt, and frequently surrounded, as if holding a levee, by a crowd of poor people, to whom he would either give alms or address a kind word. If a row of beggars was met in the street, with cheerful and pleased countenances, one might be sure that Rothschild was in the habit of passing down that way.